All right, I've been filming this topic. Guild Wars, World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy XIV. Guild Wars is the one that I'm the newest at, so I'm going to do my best to phrase all this in Guild Wars phrasing. The idea is what happens when you hit max level and you decide to go back and do anything that is not the current expansion. Now, usually in like Guild Wars or Final Fantasy, two games I have an immense history with, that is something that happens when you finish a current expansion for the first time. You're a brand new player and you decide to level an alt. You decide to go back and do things you missed. But in Guild Wars, there's actually very little required content. So you run into this almost immediately. You can regularly do anything you want. When you're out in the world, scaling just kind of happens for you, especially once level 80. Once you're level 80, that isn't really the point of Guild Wars. As a matter of fact, when you order the game, it's fairly easy to end up accidentally getting yourself a free boost to 80. When you purchase it, it's fairly easy to, while playing the game, find enough tomes of knowledge that you just feed your alt all the way to 80 without ever really even doing content on them. And so the act of leveling is not really the point. In Guild Wars, the point is all of the other things. It is a lateral progression game. And so imagine for a moment that you've hit level 80. You don't really know how. You just kind of wandered your way through it. And now you want to go back and do previous content. What is going to happen? And then we're going to talk about how this compares in Final Fantasy and Guild Wars, or Final Fantasy and World of Warcraft, but we're going to try to put it in Guild Wars terms. So you've hit max level. Well, level doesn't really matter. The first thing you're going to need to do is you're going to need to go unlock all of your specializations. That's one of the biggest things, in my opinion. You have to go get these different hero points all over the map. There's lots of ways to get them. The act of leveling feeds you a bunch. There's more available in game than you need, and that is going to allow you to unlock all of your skills because you're going to want to work on multiple builds. The first thing that I did is I went and tried out a bunch of different weapons because the left 5 of your abilities are given to you by the weapons that you equip. And so trying out different weapons feels like a huge personality change to your class. On the right side, those are your actual build. And so you unlock all those skills and then you kind of spec this out. Now there's third-party sites that'll tell you ones that are really good, but it's really fun when you first play the game to just kind of try it out. Now, as you want to start having better results, there's a lot of people who have tried a lot of this out for you and can say, what kind of personality are you looking for within the specialization? And let's get you towards something within that that has actually been optimized a fair bit. They've kind of done the math. They've stacked this up. And there ends up being kind of a solvable best spec and like gearing for each and every kind of class and group composition for every piece of content in the game. But that ends up working a little different for each piece of content. So when you're in World v World, where gear matters, when you're in SPVP, where it kind of feeds you different gear options, when you're in raids, there are different things for different pieces of content, and so you may find yourself wanting to have multiple versions of even just your main class. So it's not necessarily about alts, even though this is an incredibly alt-friendly game. And so what I find is that that's why there's build tabs at the top. That actually stores not only the build for you, which you could just do through a hyperlink in a Google document, but it also gives you a place to put that gear in there so that when I'm playing open world content and then my friend hops on, we want to go do World v World together, I can tab into that World v World build instantly. I could also just do that by having 2 of the same class on my account, 2 warriors. And let me switch over real quick and I'll go to my World v World warrior because so much of the progress is account-wide progress that would be absolutely fine. It would change my character name, but beyond that, it would do very little to penalize me. So how does that feel in old content? Well, the scaling is largely done on the back end. Each expansion is kind of just handle it. Gearing in this game, because max level never increases, once you hit level 80, you're always level 80. And so gear doesn't ever really get better. And so effectively, you work up this progression for each type of gear, heavy, light, etc. Each type of gear, you progress up it, and you really only progress up it one time per character. And not even only that, because a lot of this gear is shareable across characters, especially when we get to the final tier. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to get out of those nasty quest greens, blues, and yellows, and you're going to get into full exotics. These are gold. This would be your top end gear for the current patch in Guild Wars, in Final Fantasy or WoW, and would actually be where a lot of casual players would stop. But because it's endless progression, we're going to keep on going. You're going to push up into Ascended gear, which is kind of your like raid quality gear. And then from there, if you want, you can push into Legendary. Legendary gear is effectively, it's your Ascended gear with a cooler appearance and the ability to swap the stats in real time as often as you want, and is shareable across your account. So if you have a legendary axe and you have two classes that are using an axe to determine part of their, part or all of their left side abilities, you would share that legendary across them constantly. I don't have to, there's no transferring or anything. It just handles it through what they call their legendary armory, I think is the phrase. So leveling is kind of a weird topic to talk about because it doesn't matter. Once level 80, always level 80. There's 1,000 ways to get to level 80. None of them are wrong. One of the biggest complaints I see about Guild Wars for new players is that they don't know what to do. And when they ask the community responds with, what do you want to do? And any of you who have ever been hungry and you've asked a loved one or a friend, where do you want to go to dinner? And they respond with, I don't know, where do you want to go? You know that that's not an answer. It's incredibly infuriating. I told you I was hungry. Could you at least limit it to 2 or 3 options? No, anything's fine. Anything. We can go behind the grocery store and eat cardboard. I don't think anything. And I know it's not anything because if I say Greek, you're going to go, I had Greek for lunch. Then why didn't you say anything but Greek? Put me in the ballpark. And Guild Wars doesn't do that. Anything you want. You can level through PvP. You can level through the main story. You could level through just open world quests. You could level through anything you want. Anything and everything you do grants experience, and it's all equal and valid. And so it's easy to get lost. And where it initially felt like a sandbox that you got to build a sandcastle in and play with these cool toys, if you are left to your own devices, it can feel like a desert where you look around in all directions and there is no waypoint to find your way where you want to go. I know there's an oasis that's going to be a good fit for me. I don't know how to find it. It's the beauty and it's the weakness of Guild Wars all at once. So how does World of Warcraft and how does Final Fantasy handle leveling? Well, World of Warcraft would basically do the equivalent of pushing everybody into End of Dragons content all at the same time. New players, everybody alike, would be funneled as rapidly as possible. They would level up all in the same expansion. A new player would be fed into, let's say, Path of Fire. It's not the original. They would be fed into Path of Fire, and they would play through the Path of Fire expansion, and at some point in the middle of Path of Fire, they would hit level 80. And based on kind of how they did it, how full were they clearing the maps, were they doing some PvP, there's lots of things that grant experience. And as soon as they hit level 80, it would basically encourage them to funnel their way into End of Dragons as rapidly as possible. And then they would play through End of Dragons. Now, if they played through it narratively, I know many of you are like, well, that wouldn't make any sense. Unless they played Guild Wars 1, they're going to be confused where Cantha is. And unless they played any of the previous expansions, they're not going to know who Kaith is and all of this. How could they do End of Dragons without doing anything previously? That's a valid point. And that is a big complaint in World of Warcraft. Okay, well, how would that work with raids? Well, you're not going to have any of the previous strike knowledge. You're going to immediately be pushed into the current strikes. So all mechanics are going to be new to you. And so as a result, the community has developed multiple systems from raiding players to helping feed players the information they need to behave. But basically, the current strike's the only strike that matters. Well, that would make it feel like there aren't very many strikes. Well, Guild Wars already wants more endgame content. Just imagine if you couldn't leverage any of the previous raid wings. Imagine if you could only leverage the challenge modes as they trickled out for End of Dragons. Imagine if we got the support we got for End of Dragons, but cut Living Season 1. Don't allow previous legendaries to be relevant in End of Dragon strikes. Don't do it. Well, that would really make it feel pretty dry once I cleared all these a million times. Absolutely, it would put an enormous amount of pressure on the devs to deliver constant living seasons for the current expansion all the time. So having 5 living seasons across the history of the game, if you count Icebrood Saga as one, that's not going to cut it. You're going to need 2 or 3 living seasons for each expansion. Well, does World of Warcraft get that? No, they don't. Sometimes they do. but not always. And so when they end up in expansions where they only get one living season, you're absolutely right. They struggle with the amount of content. But what are the advantages? Well, the advantage from a World of Warcraft standpoint is this week on the 28th, I saw Guild Wars get told what their upcoming changes were 4 days out from the changes, and I saw portions of the community basically have a meltdown on whether or not they needed to just delete their warriors. As a warrior main that plays World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy and has played warrior at least a little bit in both, I'm a warrior main in Final Fantasy. I really didn't understand why people were freaking out about such a lateral game having a shift in progression. Your legendary gear transfers over, so if you need to change classes, that's not a big deal. You already have multiple specializations unlocked, so if you need to change builds, that's not a big deal. All of the content is clearable, it would just be slower, so that's not a big deal. So I really didn't understand the meltdown. When you are used to always being focused on upcoming changes, and the current round of changes is always the only thing that matters, you don't have to worry about how it leverages in old content, you don't have to worry about anything except the current expansion. Actually, a lot of Guild Wars would really shine. It's so easy to level alts. It's so easy to gear your alts. It's so easy to change across specs in real time that it would actually really shine if we were always current patch focused. Would we miss out on how much we can leverage legacy content? Absolutely. But in trade, the current balance would be the only thing that matters, and we would be used to seeing certain specs rise and fall. And unlike World of Warcraft, where you put weeks or even months into gearing that, it wouldn't be as big of a deal if one of your specs or builds fell to the wayside for a current patch cycle, because you knew another patch cycle was coming, you knew when it was coming, and once it showed up in the next living season with the next strike, that's going to be the only thing that matters. So what am I going to do? I'm going to grind all my legendaries up. I'm going to have all of my specs unlocked across a couple of different classes, and I'm just going to be ready to take it when it shows up. Now, how would this work in Final Fantasy? Well, in Final Fantasy, you would have to clear your story, first of all. It's not an optional journey. It is required. As somebody that has recently started through the Guild Wars 2 story for the first time, I just finished Tyria, I just dealt with pesky Zhaitan, I was told in chat you should really be slowing down and doing the dungeons. But as somebody that wants to get through all the story as it is told by the devs, they chose to make the dungeons optional. And so I am choosing to ignore that advice and ignore the dungeons and go straight through, because I want to be in End of Dragons as rapidly as possible. And when I looked at the fact of adding dungeons and I tried running a dungeon, people run ahead. So I would need a pre-made party to help me enjoy the dungeon in a narrative way. And once I got to cap, like, End of Dragons could be over at the pace that I'm clearing this story. And so I would rather just do the experience as the devs deemed well enough, and I would rather go through it, and then I'll have a lot of questions, and maybe I can go back and enjoy it a second time, because replayability is one of the things I really admire about Guild Wars. So in Final Fantasy, I would be forced to do this, but the dungeons would have been baked into that main story. So we have to have a reason of leveraging old dungeons. So you would have to have some sort of party finder system that pushed people into the dungeons, and it would have to do something like be part of the daily rewards, and it gives maybe that's how you get your Mystic Clovers. And so you get a Mystic Clover for running a random story dungeon, and then when I queue for a story dungeon, I'm fed in with a bunch of players. But you can already see, well, then that's just one more obligated thing. And when you look at what happens when you end up with somebody who's brand new to fractals and somebody who's just clearing their daily fractals, the disconnect between those two's capabilities, those two's expectations, and what ends up being reality can cause friction. And so I think there's a fair bit of frustration that would happen if we pushed that system into Guild Wars. Also, in Final Fantasy, level increases, just like World of Warcraft. And so, End of Dragons content would be the premier source of gear. And so you would have to run the End of Dragons strikes to get your best gear. And the new relics would be the best relics. And so there would be this frustration for, when you talk about what gearing and all of that means, if all of a sudden playing regularly requires. Comparing World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy to Guild Wars, one of the biggest things that Guild Wars gains as a strength is the ability to take breaks. People who took all of the last 2 or 3 or the 5 years off, we had a huge gap in expansions, came back for End of Dragons, today would have a pretty reasonable experience. If I wanted to, I could play from a spec that I had before End of Dragons released, all the way through End of Dragons, without ever swapping gear or build. I could. It would be valid. And so I could actually play completely straight through and never really run into any issues. And the pros of that is it makes it very easy to take breaks. The cons of that is that World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy players who may see this go, well, wouldn't that kind of suck? That I'm not encouraged to play the new abilities? That I'm not encouraged to get any of the new gear if the skins aren't for me? If I don't care about cosmetics, why am I doing a lot of the new content unless the new builds are appealing? Because you just are. And so it's why interest in End of Dragons, in my opinion, was able to fall off so quickly. Because you can come in and you can eat the cherry right off the sundae. The advantage is that it is an incredibly great time value for money. You are never doing anything in Guild Wars that you don't want to do. Even if it's something you don't enjoy, it's because you're working towards something you want. You are never, ever feeling that you have to pay or play Guild Wars if you don't want to play Guild Wars. You can always take a break, and you will not be penalized for a break, because when you come back, if you're half ascended, half legendary, you are still half ascended, half legendary. So comparing this level sync thing is kind of weird in Guild Wars, because level sync doesn't matter. Yes, it happens. When you are in old content, it is doing it. Heart of Thorns feels different than Tyria Zones. It does. But it doesn't matter, because it's handling it. The pro being that it's so easy to get into. The con being that it is very easy to lose direction. Kinda.